Good morning from Brazil, and also good afternoon, good evening, other parts of the world. I'm Pedro Melo, the CEO of IBGC, the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance. It is a pleasure to open today's webinar of our new series called IBGC Conecta, a series of online events aimed to provide knowledge related to current issues for boards, members, and governance agents. I have the honor to share this moment with prestigious names representing the most important corporate governance institutes around the world. Together, these institutes, including IBGC, are part of the GNDI, the Global Network of Directors Institute. GNDI has the purpose to assist directors worldwide to stay side by side on emerging governance issues and to collaborate to strengthen the voice of directors in advocating for good governance policies and practices. You can find more about GNDI on their website. IBGC Conecta was created to make a positive connections. Therefore, your opinion is very, very important. We encourage you to send comments, questions to this group after the presentations, and suggestions of topics for future webinars via chat, preferably in English, as well as to complete this webinar satisfaction survey at the end of the broadcast. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers of today's special webinar about challenges for boards of directors worldwide from COVID-19 crisis. I'm with Parmi Natesan. She's the CEO of IoDSA, the Institute of Directors in Southern Africa. Also, I'm with Michel de Fabiani, Policy Committee Chair at Ecoda, the European Confederation of Directors Association. I'm with Barton Edgerton, Associate Director in Governance Analytics at NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors in the United States. And I'm with Ka-Yin, the council member at the Hong Kong Institute of Directors. Thanks everyone for being with us today. I'll start with some remarks on Brazil, since this is a worldwide event. Everybody's watching from different parts of the world, and I would like to start with what we have done recently with the crisis. IBGC has run a quick survey on the crisis, where board members and management, they gave very good insights of this moment. Like 80% of the respondents of the survey, they are saying that the connection and the frequency of boards and management talking together about the crisis is very high, 80%. 74% are saying the routine of the boards has changed, and changed in a way not just more frequent, but also the consultation of specialists, how they interact, issues that they are touching, strategies that they are debating. 65% also are saying that the remote mood of being or participating in those meetings, it is very efficient. And the 35 is not that is not efficient. They are just saying that some of the issues would be better dealt if it would be in person, but very strong encouraging the boards to be in touch base. Another interesting point is, so what are the issues that they are touching on those meetings? And there are the three main ones. It is the financial situation, of course, second, people management, and third, communication, because transparency is very important. All three, it's not 1, 2, 3. They are in the same space, treated as important. And because of that, also we try to learn if they were prepared or not for that crisis. And more than 50%, they said we have had debates on risk management or crisis management, but 92% is saying even though we had that, we were not prepared for such a crisis and the size of the crisis. And also, we, besides the survey, we have collected different opinions through the IBGC Conecta, and some of the board members, they are saying that the distance between the board and management has narrowed for the crisis. But the question is this going to be the new normal, considering that crisis should be more often? Also, in facing their own problems, how they could make even bigger support to society at large, and no dismissal, for example, it is something very strong in Brazil. It is a time for innovation and technology, very much being explored, how it can help the business. ASG, it is also a big debate, and that should come stronger after crisis. The process should be changed to accommodate and have a more strong alliance with ASG. With that debate of ASG, it comes to the other debate, which is who the companies are serving, and it is about the shareholders or stakeholders. This is also a strong debate on the board. And finally, to pass to my colleagues, it is for sure the Brazilian boards, they are recognizing that the world has been very strong connected more than ever, because any crisis anywhere, it's clear now that it's going to impact any size, anyone, anywhere. And therefore, those are the remarks on Brazil. And I would like to pass now to Parmi and Natesan from the CEO of IoDSA. Parmi, thanks to him for being with us. Tell us about South Africa.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for having me. Yeah, I think a bit of a similar picture. I kind of relate to a lot of what you've said already. I think right in the beginning, when this thing first hit us in South Africa, that was around middle of March, I think there was a bit of shock in the system, to be honest, for directors at that point. And you saw lots of emergency board meetings being called to look at it, but really from a short-term perspective. Okay, what do we do right now? Let's dust off our disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans, and let's see how we can keep this organization functioning in the short term. And I think now that we in South Africa have been in lockdown for already over a month, and it's been extended now indefinitely, I think that conversation is shifting a little bit to a bit of a more of a medium-term conversation to say, well, this may be the new normal now, this new way of doing business. It may not be just a short-term patching a problem. We may need to be relooking in the medium term, relooking at our strategy, as you mentioned, innovation and technology and all of that. And how are we as a board going to help this organization survive and thrive through this crisis, but then even after the crisis? And I think that conversation has shifted a little bit in recent time. The one thing I guess, fortunate about South Africa is that we've always practiced a stakeholder model of governance for many years. So I think for us, business is a lot more conscious of its impact on all of the capitals and its need for all of the capitals in order to function. And I think, therefore, in those difficult conversations that boards needed to have around financial capital, human capital, and the rest, where trade-offs need to be made. For example, if you have to ask your employee force not to come to work, for the sake of their health, you're investing in human capital at the expense of possibly earning financial capital during that time. And I think the trade-offs was a big conversation that needed to be had. Similarly, you mentioned about the social conscience. I've seen over the last couple of months just such an immense will of business to do good, not only for themselves and their own financial or other benefit, but for society at large. I think people are realizing that we actually need each other in this interconnected world, and we can't be looking at just ourselves anymore in isolation. A couple of other, I think, practical things that have been discussed. The one is succession planning for key positions on the board and of management. I think it's something we speak about. It's something in our code of governance that should be there. But I think it's often an area that gets neglected because it's somewhat uncomfortable to talk about. And I think this crisis that none of us expected and none of us thought we'd actually live through, see in our lifetimes, has really raised questions around how ready are we in terms of our emergency succession plans for our leadership to be able to continue. And I mean, leadership is so important in a time of crisis. And what would happen if a CEO or a chairman of the board were to fall ill and be quarantined for a number of days? And I think boards have had to face that conversation. A few practicalities just to end off from my side. How to conduct board meetings now that we can't be in a room together. I think that's been an adjustment for many. Many were reluctant in the beginning. People thought you wouldn't be able to have an effective board meeting on a system like we are on today, because they thought you lose out on the human interaction of sitting in a room together. Frequency of board meetings, as you mentioned, I definitely think there are possibly more board updates happening now than there would be in a normal board cycle. Having said that, I think it's very important that we ensure that boards are not becoming too operationally involved, that they're still fulfilling their oversight role, albeit at a few more updates than would normally be the case. Also, another practicality that we're facing in South Africa at the moment, with a lot of companies having a December year end, is how we're going to run our annual general meetings, because those usually happen 6 months after year end. So a lot of companies are really looking at how they're going to be able to run annual general meetings with the need for social distancing at this point in time. And then the other very practical point is around statutory submissions. Often directors are accountable to ensure that the organization meets its reporting requirements to the various regulators. So submission of financial statements and other returns, etc., have to be done within a certain time frame after year end. And it's those kind of practicalities that boards are thinking about at this point in time. I think in a nutshell, that's my opening remarks, Pedro.
Well, thanks, Parmi. Very, very good points you have brought to us, and some of those I think we come back and debate, especially this one on succession and the last one on board responsibilities, given the compliance that everybody has to have for the annual meetings and closings. And thanks a lot. We are going to come back to that. Michel, if you could join us and tell what's going on in France and also in the European environment and the boards, with the boards. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I will talk for Europe, which we represent. And don't forget that Europe is 28 countries, including the UK, and more than 30 languages and probably 100 sorts of cultures. So this being said, we were all hit almost at the same time and in the same way, despite all our differences in Europe. Italy, Spain, UK, France, all countries have been, almost all, I would say, countries have been confined in March, roughly speaking. So, and the economy stopped for everybody more or less at the same time. So whatever our differences, this crisis has hit us all exactly in the same way. And the first thing, our institution, Ecoda, has produced a position paper released on 27th of March to alert boards to immediately meet with management, to support management on what we think will have been probably the worst ever crisis, and therefore crisis management needed to be done immediately. First things were sanitary measures, health and safety for employees, suppliers, and customers, employment and unemployment situation, avoiding unemployment in the immediate short term, and cash and financial situation, considering liquidity, dividends, remunerations, bank loans and guarantees, insurance situation, aid from the state or support from the state. And this was a totally full picture to be dealt with in, let's say, a week or so. Now we enter into the period of deconfinement. It so happens that today, Italy deconfined, Spain end of last week, France next week, so UK probably soon, hopefully. So we are all in the same, again, in a similar situation in Europe, more or less at the same time. Now we encourage boards to meet regularly with executives to understand the next decisions. And the next decision will be what I call the post-COVID, hopefully the post-COVID situation. We'll have to review our activities, our sites, our offices, to review our supply chain, identify the weak point or the risk point. And supply chain means not just for our company or our group, but all along the suppliers of our suppliers of our suppliers, etc., everywhere in the world. And also, we will need to look at the analysis of risks and more than risk, which was done. Let's say the impact. What is the impact of what we are doing and where we are doing? And this is much more than risk. It's really the financial impact, the sanitary impact, the health impact, the impact on community. And of course, this means that this was very much discussed at the European level already, but it means now that ESG is becoming more than before an urgent requirement for everything we do. We will have to consider what is our relation with the state in future. In Europe, the European Central Bank and national governments and all banks have given billions and hundreds of billions of guarantees, loans, aids to companies. Even the biggest companies have received aid. So the relationship with the government will need to be looked at carefully, company by company. The threat of nationalization is there. Some have been done, very few. So it's something which will need to be looked at. Activist shareholders are around the corner. Some have already pointed their nose, as we say. So this is to be considered. The second point is the competition landscape. There are threats, of course, we know that, but there may be opportunities. After a crisis, there is usually a period of mergers, acquisition, joint ventures, new alliances, new competitors. And this will need to be looked at rather soon, at least examined rather soon. We will have to consider, of course, our shareholders, but who will be our shareholders in 6 months' time is another question. But more certainly, all our stakeholders, which will remain with us where we operate. And there is even now the creation of what we call stakeholders committees, which will advise boards on top of the existing committees, the classic committees, which were existing: finance, remuneration, governance, etc. This will probably bring the EU legislation to be revised. It was on the verge of being revised, but this will be probably accentuated. And certainly directors' duties, a directive on directors' duties exists, but it will be reinforced, including and compelling ESG considerations, stakeholders and shareholders, employees probably as the first stakeholder. This was already I would say, the case in Europe, in many countries, but it will become certainly a European characteristic. Succession plans, of course. There is another dimension which is much more general, which is what is the purpose of your company, what we call the corporate purpose, which will be redefined, and we encourage our companies to look at it and redefine, which is to create value for shareholders indeed and stakeholders, and the relevant stakeholders. So you have to identify them and include all ESG consideration in your analysis. And in society terms, there will be implications much wider than for our European activities. All other nearby geographies and economies like the South Mediterranean, the East Mediterranean, the Africa, North Africa, and this will include even the link with immigration, employment of immigrants, etc. So it's a much more wider issue. There will be also a review of the balance of state intervention, state support, inequalities within Europe, because not just between social categories, but between countries, we realize that this crisis has shown inequalities, and this will be a big issue in future. Large cities versus suburbs versus countryside. And of course, the big issue of tax budget deficits, which will need to be resolved. So for the corporations and for the boards, we think that we come from a current very short-term immediate crisis analysis to suddenly and rather soon a much wider impact risk analysis encapsulating all ESG considerations. And as an institution of advocacy, we will certainly be even more involved in the coming months and year with the European Union to harmonize and to push for legislation which permits boards and management to work even more together to create value for shareholders and stakeholders, which is our slogan, if you want, in Ecoda at the moment. Thank you.
Well, Michel, thanks a lot. It is really good to listen to you. It's a different environment, the European Union, how they are operating together and facing all those issues, and also many comments you made, but how ESG can come after the crisis even stronger, and with either more regulation or our institutes getting involved and supporting changes in this debate between stakeholders and shareholders. With that, I go to Barton. Barton represents the NACD in United States. Welcome. Share with us our experiences in United States.
Excellent, thank you. This is my first meeting of the morning, so excuse me if I have a couple of sips of coffee along the way.
Go ahead.
I'd like to start off by, I think I broadly agree with both Michel and Parmi in the sense that we are now moving solidly to a kind of a second phase of the crisis, where we're moving beyond crisis response and a reactive approach for many of our boards to one that is a little bit more thoughtful and reactive and forward-looking, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But would really like to just set the ground, the groundwork for a moment by just noting a couple of things. One, the United States has a very complex situation with a lot of variation across geographies. Just share with you a moment of this, just to get a sense of some of the challenges that just domestic organizations in the United States are facing, not to mention the ones that have a far larger global footprint. So in the United States, primarily, it is the governors of the 50 states, as well as the various territories like the District of Columbia, that are responsible for the opening or closing of various parts of the economy. But even more than that is that at the local level, the city and county level, there's a lot of discretion that mayors and county executives have. So, you know, as you may know, only about 45 of the 50 states ended up closing businesses as part of a thoroughgoing lockdown. So there were 5 or 6 states that kept pretty much business as usual. But even within states who have slightly lifted some of the restrictions, there are mayors as well as county executives that are keeping some of those restrictions in place. So there's a lot of complexity that organizations are dealing with as they think towards the future. The other thing that I was struck with was just how quickly many of our boards have adjusted to a new and different environment. I was on a conference call with about 100 directors in mid-March. And what struck me about it is it was on Zoom. There were, as I mentioned, about 100 participants. They were in our director demographic. And I would say that is not historically a group who is very attuned to using Zoom and video. And what struck me is that within several weeks of the crisis, nearly every individual on the call was not only on video, but it worked pretty well. Nobody was stuck on mute. There was not a lot of technology hiccups. And I was thinking to myself, just a couple of months earlier, this would not have been the case. And it struck me how quickly the speed with which we can change our behavior has really happened. So in the United States, the NACD, we have about 22,000 individual members. And in our discussions with them, in webinars, one-on-one discussions, some peer networking groups that we've been doing online, really we've been able to identify that the first stage of the response is pretty consistent with many of the others, that health and safety of employees was top of mind first, along with the financial viability of the organization. The board itself focused on some crisis response issues, so opening up the playbook and coming to terms with the idea that we're not only going to have virtual board meetings, increased interactions with our senior management, but also, as Parmi had mentioned, considering a lot of the annual board meetings or annual governance meetings, moving those to virtual. But really 6 topics have come to the forefront when we've been speaking with our directors. The first, perhaps not surprisingly, is the relationship with management. So we have seen directors really lean in a lot where necessary. Good deal of variation here. Usually it's the most leaning in, we'll see an experienced board or an experienced board member with executive experience that will lean in and support a relatively new CEO or one with a little bit less experience with crisis management, but also leaning in with their expertise a little bit more in general. One question we do get a lot is, how can we lean in appropriately and make sure that we don't overburden management with our good intentioned requests, knowing that if it often takes management a lot of time and energy to answer even simple questions. The second piece is around the dynamics of the board and maintaining board effectiveness. How can we ensure that our virtual meetings are as effective as possible? So virtual meetings, we have found generally last far shorter than the in-person meetings, going from 8 hours to 2 hours. How can we rearrange the agenda to effectively focus on those issues that are most important for our organization? Performance and pay has been an important issue as well. A number of high-profile CEOs took pay cuts or temporarily suspended their pay during this period of time. Some boards have done that as well. And so we have a good number of discussions around the proper way to do that. From the perspective of NACD, it's generally around making sure that boards are reflective about the way in which they approach this. We've had a couple of high-profile hiccups in the United States where CEOs took pay cuts, but at the same time were granted some options which have the potential to be windfall several years down the road, and really just making sure that that boards are aware of some of those considerations when they're thinking through this. Yeah, with certainly management being overwhelmed with a lot of the day-to-day to the crisis, we also have a potential opportunity and have been speaking with directors who are looking at ways that they can themselves take some of the burden off management. Stakeholder communications, especially with investors, but with other stakeholders as well. Two issues are perhaps not surprising and are ones that are really well within the purview of the board. The fifth one is looking at the risks and opportunities, especially those risks that present themselves that are perhaps new and unusual with this crisis. I had a colleague many years ago who mentioned that nobody worried about the assumptions that underlie perhaps some short-term responses to ensure that those short-term responses are also in accordance with scenarios for the long term. We might not know what the long term will look like or what the recovery will look like, but we can certainly think hard and carefully about whether or not the short-term solutions that we have now put us in a position where we might be able to take advantage of certain scenarios versus cornering us and taking some of those scenarios off the plate. So those 6 issues are really the ones I think that have come to the top of top of mind for many of our directors. One of the things maybe just to note about the NACD is the NACD is not an advocacy organization, but what we are is we're a convening organization. So I do suspect over time what we will be doing is convening wide swaths of stakeholders, from organizations to regulatory bodies to stakeholders in the ESG space and really just the entire ecosystem in which our members operate to help understand what are some of the best paths forward. But I'll leave it there. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Barton. Now we go to Ka-Yin. He's a council member of the Hong Kong Institute of Directors. If you can share your environment with us, would be great. But we see a lot of commonality in some of the topics here, but it was great to listen the 6 items that Barton put it to us. How all that compares to your environment, Ka-Yin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. In fact, the situation, the context in Hong Kong is a little different. It's a little different because with Hong Kong people so worried about a repeat of the SARS outbreak in 2003, Hong Kong people jumped to wear masks very early on. And in that way, they protect themselves. And maybe for that reason, it helps to keep the number of confirmed cases in Hong Kong very low. And with very low confirmed number of cases, in Hong Kong, there has been no real lockdown. There have been some forced closures. There are some travel restrictions. There are some quarantine requirements, but essentially things go on. Restaurants try to stay open. In fact, they have to stay open to try to pay the rent. Shops want to stay open because, again, they need the money to pay the rent and pay the salary to their workers. But on the whole, it's not exactly business as usual. And the reason being, people are just sort of more worried about interactions. So yes, they keep the social distancing. And in that situation, many businesses are actually suffering from a huge drop in revenue. Even though there are difficulties, it's a good sign that we see some creativity amongst Hong Kong business owners. For instance, in some restaurants, the operators were so creative and so quick in coming up with little petitions made out of very easily available materials, cheap materials, but somehow effective materials to help meet the social distancing requirements and partition requirements in restaurants, just to try to stay open. We also see a change in the way business is done. Hong Kong being a very compact place, people go out, people go do the shopping by themselves, and so they go out and eat. But with people more worried about dining out and patronage is dropping, some restaurants, even some Michelin-star restaurants, have decided to offer takeout menus. So this is a change. You go to a Michelin-star restaurant really for the dining service, but and these Michelin-star restaurants, they don't normally allow takeouts, maybe because that can actually affect the quality of what they are serving you. But they are changing their course, they are changing their business. They are actually making a dent into what their core business service is in order to try to stay afloat. So in some way, we are seeing Hong Kong businesses trying really hard to stay afloat when there is no mandatory lockdown and things have to go on, and some landlords are just not being kind. And there are some landlords who will reduce the rent, but there are still a number who are sort of stubborn and do not want to budge. So we mentioned that the outbreak may be making the board and management coming closer together. And I think we had some great examples of how it's happening. In Hong Kong, the situation, the context may be yet a little different, because in Hong Kong, we have, for the listed companies, we tend to have a majority of executive directors. So the directors, the majority of them are already managers. We do require a third of the board being independent, but because the majority are already managers, this gives an interesting issue for us to think about. Maybe we don't see all the pictures, know all the pictures now, but it's going to be an interesting notion when we look back later on when the dust settles. What is the effect of this executive board? Does it help decision making? Does it help companies react to crisis, react to situations quicker? We don't know all the answer at the moment, but I think the general observations lately is there are like easily two contrasting views. The very pessimistic view is the managers can run wild with exactly what they want to do. They can just basically skip the non-executives and just make decisions on their own. But the other view may be more positive. And I think that that more positive view goes like this. It is true that when you have managers running the show, they can indeed make decisions quicker. And in fact, I think we are seeing this happening in many Hong Kong companies. But does it mean that they will actually leave the non-executive directors out of the loop? Probably not so. I actually asked around some of my fellow directors sitting on boards big and small. The sense is, it is still a matter of what the board had decided to be considered board level matters. And even for board level matters, it may still depend on whether things have been properly delegated to management. So it doesn't mean that there is no safeguard. It doesn't mean that the managers will just run wild all the time. And also, when there is a good set of protocols, a good set of procedures, then even the majority executive directors, they probably will have to think about and gauge the reactions of the non-executives when when the time comes to get their endorsement or support or ratification. And the other supporting evidence to this sort of positive view is that many boards in Hong Kong and Hong Kong, China, the Hong Kong, China region, they are using the video conferencing, they are getting on the phones, they are actually having at least regular briefing sessions and holding regular meetings. Maybe in some cases they will be meeting more often when the situation requires. So on the whole, Hong Kong businesses seems to be able to meet the crisis, but the one important thing that we have to remember and remind ourselves when we look at the situation in Hong Kong is, it is not exactly the outbreak that is hurting Hong Kong and the Hong Kong companies. It is probably the 6 months before the outbreak started. It has been 6 months of protests since the summer of 2019 on Hong Kong streets that has already been causing a lot of disruptions to local businesses. And since that time, tourists basically have not been coming. The locals are probably wanting to stay home more often. In that sense, it's a double whammy. It's a double whammy to Hong Kong businesses. And the sense is, with this going on, and we are again bracing for another 3 months of protests leading up to the major local election in September, some people are worried that when the outbreak is over, the protests will return. So it could be another few months of disruption to Hong Kong businesses. So we have to continue to watch the situation to really see how it's going to impact the Hong Kong market. But the 6 months worth of protests and the several months of outbreak may be causing some changes, some cultural change in the way business is done in Hong Kong. Again, Hong Kong is a very compact place. People have generally been finding it easy to go to work. And so even when a strong hurricane hits Hong Kong, literally people expect to go back to work within 2 hours when the strong wind signal is lowered. So in this sort of very tight, compact urban environment, we are now seeing more of a need for businesses, for companies to actually allow, maybe even require some of their workers to work from home. How does it fare? Depends. The larger companies, the bigger businesses, the multinational, they tend to be doing better in this aspect. The smaller businesses, maybe they have a will, but the technology is not catching up. So going forward, maybe there is going to be an impetus for change. And along with that working from home phenomenon, maybe it could also prompt the Hong Kong businesses who expect the employees to go to work at fixed time, most of the time, to actually start thinking more about flexible working arrangements. So in a place like Hong Kong, a very urban environment, work-life balance can, if you package it in the right way, if you design a good scheme and sell it to employees, maybe your workers would thank you for that. So this may be a chance. There may be a chance for Hong Kong businesses to actually adjust the way in how they treat their workers and how they actually arrange for work to be done, which may be a good thing. Maybe on a larger scale, then my worry is the Hong Kong business, the local economy has come to rely so much on tourism, on visitors. But with visitors not coming, especially the mainland visitors, how are Hong Kong businesses going to adjust their business model? Are their revenue models still credible? Can they have a means to actually find new ways to do business, find new customers, morph their business model and morph the strategy into something else, cater more to local businesses. Can they do that? Can they survive that way? Maybe, but then the one final point for us to remember is, Hong Kong landlords, the land masters, are they willing to actually take some haircut to rent that they charge? Because that may be killing a lot of business.
Thank you, Ka-Yin. Very good insights. Some of the insights are very different from what we are passing through in the other jurisdictions that we are talking about here. Thanks a lot for that. And let me tell you, we already have very good questions here from the public. And the first one is from Matthias Mangels. He says, well, good morning to you. Well, what are the key questions you want answers from the executive team? Boards would ask from the executive teams on COVID recovery plans. What are the questions on that board should be asking management on recovery plans? Any insights that you would like to share? Anyone?
Pedro, I can come in with me.
Great.
I think firstly, it's just an understanding. I think if I was sitting as a non-executive director on a board, I would be wanting an understanding of how COVID, and I extend it beyond COVID / lockdown / the economic and social impact of everything that's happening, how all of that impacts on the organization's business model. So what the organization needs to do its work, what it does and what it produces, and how what we're going through now impacts on each layer of that within the business, and how management is going to almost mitigate the impact thereof so that the company can still survive and thrive. That's kind of top of mind for me in terms of what I would be asking.
Michel, you were in your words, you were saying that in the European community, there are already recommendations how the companies should be taken from now on. Anything that you'd like to complement in what you said, or maybe considering what Parmi just said?
Well, for the very short term, clearly companies have to look at their employees, the families of their employees, the schools issues. You know, schools are closed until probably the summer. So how do you organize work differently? Apart from health, which is an obvious one, it's all about organizing work, and keeping jobs is the other immediate point which needs to be looked at carefully. Because at the moment there are support from the states for keeping people at work, but it will not last forever. As soon as full deconfinement is done, we come back to a more normal situation. So do you lay off or you don't lay off? Do you continue part-time? Do you reduce remuneration to keep the workforce less impacted?
Thank you. I would like to.
Yeah, I think that you know, there's certainly the short-term considerations, and I think looking at the balance between safety and financial viability, and there's a lot of questions there, I think, that are relatively straightforward. I do think the question that I would encourage directors to, or management to, I guess, look for directors to ask is around scenarios, and to really think about not only the short term, but the medium and long term around, you know, what happens if our assumptions around this are wrong. I think that most organizations as well as governments are counting on the possibility of a vaccine within the next year, year and a half, but that might not happen. I mean, it might just be the type of the disease where there is no vaccine and we have to live with it. There might be more akin to the 1918 flu outbreak. There might be a second or even tertiary wave. And to think through, what are the scenarios that our organization might encounter, and how might each of those impact the way in which we might think about going back to work? Might we hold things back in the next 6 months because we have only moderate confidence that we will have some sort of stability, a little bit further down the road from that. So I do think encountering the different scenarios that might play out and looking at really a wide range of those, and even a couple of outlandish ones that might help us, push our thinking a little bit in terms of what happens if something now unexpected follows from the virus in 6 months or a year.
Thanks, Ka-Yin. Would you like to complement this topic?
I had a thought because Barton mentioned the vaccine, which sparked a thought and maybe a pessimistic thought from me. I mentioned that Hong Kong did quite well in being able to keep a very low number of confirmed cases, which is very good. We only have just about 1,000 cases. But this low number may come back to haunt Hong Kong, and I hope not, but it may. And how is it going to come back to haunt Hong Kong? When the US, when Europe, when the rest of the world is raring to go back to work, and when the lockdowns finally are canceled, when people want to go back to resume normal business, then I'm sure that some of the businessmen will be jumping on the plane, fly into Hong Kong, into China to talk business, make their orders, do business, check into our hotels, go to our restaurants, shop. Hong Kong people have been wearing masks, which has been good. But wearing a mask is not going to be a permanent solution. We may be wanting some kind of an effective vaccine that will work for different strands of the virus. But if there is no vaccine, we're counting on a vaccine being available in about a year since the outbreak, maybe 18 months. But if the vaccine is not coming, are Hong Kong people going to wear masks for the next 10 years? Or if they wear masks and they don't wear it properly, and the rest of the world flock into Hong Kong, flock into China, and suddenly the herd immunity concept comes back to mind. What if the Americans, the European visitors, travelers from around the world, they have been exposed to the disease, they have some kind of antibody so they don't get sick? If that's true, they don't get sick, but they come interact with Hong Kong people, will Hong Kong people actually have not been exposed to the virus before, suddenly get sick and plunder Hong Kong into its worst nightmare? Now, I think it goes back to Barton's point, which is, are people making the right assumptions? They can only make assumptions based on what they credibly know and can believe. But if Hong Kong businesses and the Hong Kong government have too optimistic a view, and like the rest of the world, Hong Kong wants to drum up business again, wants to reopen and want to lift the travel restrictions and want to welcome American and European travelers and businessmen and tourists, what might happen? Are the businesses ready for that next phase? So this is a pessimistic thought. I hope it won't happen. But now that we have seen something unexpected happening around the world, maybe we should always keep that in mind.
Thanks, Sam. We have more and more questions, and maybe I'm going to be more direct to you with the questions that we are receiving. Some of the questions are addressed to some of you. The next one is from Luis Marta. Barton, how have you seen business adopt a social leadership role through the crisis? Do you think this is temporary or here or to stay?
Was that social leadership?
Yeah.
Well, we had done a survey of American independent directors last year, and we asked around questions about environmental, social, and governance, ESG issues. And what we identified is that oftentimes when we ask about ESG as a thing writ large, so just ask about board engagement with ESG, we get relatively low numbers. It tends to be higher among private, public listed companies than compared to private ones. And generally, more engaged organizations are also larger organizations. But what was interesting when we asked about the individual components is we saw that the vast majority of organizations, about 80%, thought that they were doing a lot around the S, the social issues. And that's been only more so since the crisis. The other thing I would note is that the Business Roundtable in the United States, the group of top CEOs headed by Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, re-released their corporate purpose statement some time ago, within the last about 6 months or so. And what was interesting about that is it was the first time since the 80s where explicitly a corporate broader stakeholder conception of corporate purpose was put in. And what I thought was particularly interesting about that is the Business Roundtable made a point to suggest that they were adjusting their statement to include the social issues because it's what they were already doing in the first place. So they change a position, but to better reflect what they do. So all of that is, I guess, a little bit of a preamble to suggest that social leadership of organization is something that I think business leaders and boards in the United States, it's been top of mind for them. It's something I think that they are seeing some pretty significant benefits for, and that I would expect it to be something to continue in the future. Now, I will give a caveat to this, because looking back at some of the predictions that were made coming out of the Great Financial Recession, especially those around maybe reduction in risk for organizations, increased savings rates in the United States amongst individuals, we saw that not a lot of that materialized, and that it was within a couple of years where we went back to a little bit of a new normal. Though I think there's some indication that some of the risk taking was a little bit slow as well. So I think balancing both of those, I do think that certainly now and in the next phases of the crisis, the social component will be top of mind. That's just looking at employees. One other note, maybe another way to conceive of social leadership is the role of business leadership in general across the population. The Edelman Trust Survey of last year, and I think the last couple of years, has listed business leaders as more trusted than government or media leaders. And I think that now we have seen that to be even more pronounced as well. There's been large contingents of business leaders, both at the national level in the United States, as well as at more local levels, who are taking a leadership role at the reopening of the economy, looking really not only at their own cash flows and kind of their internal part of the organization, but also considering, do employees want to go back to work? Will they feel safe going back to work if they were previously remote? Will our customers return to the same purchasing patterns that we've had in the past? What do we need to do to adjust to those customers and make sure that they are either satisfied in their needs or their consumer experience, or how can we adjust for that? So I do think that there's a dual role that we're seeing, and at least for the the short term, I would expect that the social leadership of organizations to continue.
Thanks a lot, Barton. Thanks a lot. I go to Parmi. In fact, it is two questions, different things. One is South Africa and Brazil, they have a commonality as inequality in society at large. And the question is, we are seeing in Brazil a lot of pressure to stop the lockdown and to bring the economy back, because people, small and medium companies are suffering a lot. And therefore, there is a lot of pressure to come back. How the boards are reacting to that pressure? They are more in favor of the pressure for the economy to come back, or they are thinking different ways, or maybe to stand for more time? And what it is the reaction in that regard?
Yeah, I think, it's very similar because of the social environment that we live with and the levels of poverty and social inequality in the country, that this lockdown really, really impacted people significantly. And it was really, I mentioned earlier around the trade-offs, it was really about saying, okay, is it the economy or is it health? What is the primary concern that we're trying to address here? What comes first? So I think it's a very difficult question, because I see it on the ground. I see companies struggling. I see, Ka-Yin mentioned the tourism sector. I see it even with food industry in South Africa, because restaurants aren't allowed to operate at this point in time. And there's a certain level of lockdown that they will be able to reopen, but they're saying they don't know if they're going to be reopening, because they don't know if they'll be able to pay their rent type. That's the practical thing that we're seeing. I think a lot of boards are taking a stance of, if we can, let's put the lives of our people, our human capital, and our stakeholders first. So wherever possible, let's try to innovate, be able to work remotely, have your workforce accessible anyway, even if they're not physically accessible. Try to sustain some form of revenue and economic activity during this time, while still protecting the lives of our people and our stakeholders. And I think that's been the approach that I've seen most commonly is, certain industries are luckier than others in that they can do that. And wherever possible, whichever industries can do that, that's really the option that they're going for, is to sustain some level of economic activity in the meantime, while we really protect the health of our people.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Parmi. And the second question, I think it is because when you first spoke, you made the comment of the annual meetings, the annual compliance, and how do they boards have to keep up or ask management to keep up on compliance with all the rules and regulations, how that is being taken in South Africa?
So I think, luckily, our regulators have kind of come to the party, and obviously they understand what business is going through at this time. So they have been relaxing of some of the requirements from the regulator side, where they've extended some deadlines for certain submissions, etc., to make it plausible for business to do what they need to do and still be compliant. I also see a lot of investigations into doing things differently. So, organizations are still planning to have the annual general meetings within 6 months of their year end, but it may not be everybody in the same room together. It may be a virtual AGM, which is allowed in South Africa in our Companies Act. And so it's really about those investigations at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Michel. We have two questions on Europe. The first one is, considering that governments are helping companies and providing resources in one way or the other, what it is the expectation, like what happened in the bank crisis in 2008, when a lot of businesses who were supported by government. He already mentioned, but I would like maybe you comment on that. All that support coming from public, how is that going to change maybe rules on risk management or ASG or any other rules because of this support?
Well, first thing is clearly the European Union and the national states have taken the view that the support from the state was special, exceptional, temporary, and not an intrusion of the state forever. This being said, there is a political push towards more state intervention. And this is one of the hiccups of the situation. Some people say, look, you go to the state and you like the help of the state, why don't you take it permanently? Which means this sort of old Marxist thoughts, which have not disappeared in Europe. But this is still a minority, but it's resurging in a way. Now, the real point is that the ESG is becoming a must, and obviously, contrary to the US perhaps, where the large corporations may still be trusted, at the moment there is a sort of accusation to the large corporation to say, hey, aren't you guilty of what's happening one way or another on the environment and the societal side, but more on the environment? It's not just about climate change. It's about, and you have a lot of activities like mining, oil and gas, the car industry polluting, energy, nuclear energy with other sorts of risks, mining, I said, pharmaceuticals, etc. So there is a huge push of the consumers to say, look, stop what you are doing and review it completely. And I think the boards have taken the message that there is the optimistic view, it will come back as before. It's just a huge crisis, but it will come back to normal. I think this is an illusion. And the consumers and the political movement, but even more the consumers, will not accept that. There is the other extreme, which is the state can do it all, let's go to the state, or the nationalist retrenchment, which is, in our small country, we are strong and we are protected if we work together only in our small corner. These are the two extremes. So I think the companies have to take the lead, and this is a position we support, take the lead on this and show that you know what your impact is. If it is negative, say it, be transparent, inform on how you mitigate, how you compensate, what do you do to make it better. If you can't make it better, change what you do. And if it's really impossible, stop what you do. So boards will have to review all that. And there is also a push from the investors. You've seen the BlackRock letter, the Amundi letter, the French and Norwegian investment funds who say, look, we want to invest for the longer term. So look at longer term considerations. But I think in Europe, it's not just about climate, it's about the environment, generally speaking. And socially, it's about remunerations, more equality. We had a lot on equality, on gender, etc. Now it will be more on minimum equality within Europe. And I think the introduction of a fairness ratio on remuneration will be scrutinized. It was thought to be a sort of another number, but I believe it will be scrutinized and corporations look at it very carefully.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you. And now a question that it goes to everyone, and the question it is from Armando Henriques, taking consideration what Ka-Yin mentioned on how it works in Hong Kong, and taking for example that most of the boards they are formed by executives, and therefore that distance, in fact, it is much more practical day to day and fast on the response. The question is, seeing what we are seeing in Hong Kong and what Ka-Yin mentioned, how do you see in your jurisdiction that difference between how do we operate and Hong Kong operate? And I don't know, Barton, would you like to start?
Sure, and I think you mean more respect into the independence of boards. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. So public companies in the United States are majority independent. I do think that, as I mentioned at the beginning, at this moment, we are seeing boards lean in much more than in the past. But I do think that one of the unique values that many directors in our association recognize is even if they have, even if they're, I would say, quasi-independent, so ones that may be formally independent but have been on the board for a decade or 2 decades, others with more intimate knowledge of the business operations or the executive personalities, that even they will recognize that the importance of the board as a part-time, more or less independent body is that it can provide that medium to long-term perspective, which can be very, very difficult for management to have during a crisis like this. So we had a lot of questions and discussions with our membership in the March and April timeframe around really thinking about that longer term. Now, at that time, the longer term was more in the 3 to 6 month range, as opposed to the day-to-day range. But not having the day-to-day, moment-to-moment really focus that management has to have has allowed, I think, the membership really to think of themselves as being able to abstract and elevate some of the discussions that they have. I would say one of the things that we touched on at the beginning, both Parmi and Michel had mentioned, is moving from that stage 1 of crisis response to stage 2, is that we saw, I think, relatively quickly, management and boards moving from a very ad hoc, idiosyncratic mode of communication. Should there be a weekly phone call, a daily email, emails from the CFO, from the CEO, we're not moving into a more regular form of communication where maybe once a week there'll be an email that comes in the same format, same time of day, so forth, that allows for more regular updates. So I do think that certainly in the United States, the legally mandated independence, as well as the tradition of independence, it really now is the value of it is seen in that more longer term perspective. And I'll stress more long term, because as I mentioned, is really the immediate focus has been on a lot of the crisis response. So even if it's 6 months out and not 3 years out, I think that many of our directors recognize that's a truly unique role and one of their real strategic values that they can add to the organization.
Parmi, well, thanks, Barton. Parmi, would you like to react to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think, firstly, similarly, South Africa also has requirements in our governance code for the majority of the board members to be non-executive directors. And I think it makes sense if you consider our whole evolution of stakeholder model of governance, because you want more voices at the table. You know, if you have just management making all the decisions, there could be a bit of a narrow focus. The management is so engrossed in the runnings of that organization. And a lot of the decisions that they make, there's an inherent conflict because the decisions that they make are going to impact their remuneration at the end of the day, you know, in terms of short-term and long-term incentives, etc. So I think having non-executives to bounce things off and to assist with decisions helps, because it takes into account the needs, expectations of various stakeholders when you're coming to a decision that's in the best interest of that organization. I think in terms of, I hear the point that you can make decisions a lot quicker if the board is executive, but are they better decisions in the long run? That's the question, one. Two, I also don't think the structure of having non-executives should prevent management from being able to make quick decisions and moving forward. And that's why that having a delegation of authority framework is so important. Because I, as a non-executive director, there's many operational decisions that I can make myself without the board needing to get involved. But, you know, more complex or higher level or higher value decisions, I may need to then consult with the board. And I think we mustn't see it as a stumbling block, but as an enabler to better decision-making in the best interest of the company.
Thank you, Michel.
Yes, independent directors in Europe are a must in listed companies, and that's obvious. And they even need to chair the audit committee or the finance committee, for instance, and the governance committee. So they have roles which are recognized. And
we lost Michel. Our team is going to get in touch with him. And meanwhile, Ka-Yin, would you like to? Yeah, you are back. You are back.
Sorry, I was interrupted by a nuisance in my home. So, sorry. So independent directors will be even more reinforced. The second point is family-owned companies, which are very numerous in Europe, also now want at least one or two independent directors. And the important point is about what I would call the diversity on boards, which will be reinforced by the current crisis and situation. Diversity in Europe was almost about gender for a long time. Now it's about everything: gender, experience, culture, origins, etc., education. So I think it's a very important component for the future. And yes, more working together, as was mentioned earlier in the US, more working together between the boards. For instance, there was a strategic seminar every year. Now it will be almost for every company. It was a best practice. Visits of boards on the ground, visiting a site, visiting a distribution center, a logistic, whatever, a research, a lab. And as was mentioned for South Africa, the rule of delegation will need to be very clearly stated as part of the ongoing work. But I agree, in companies where I sit, we receive a daily press information, a weekly mail from the CEO. It doesn't need to be long. Sometimes 2 lines are enough. And we have a monthly meeting, and this will be probably more under video than it was before, which will save time and money for everybody. Another point I want to mention is the minority shareholder representation, which is very important and will take even more consideration in future.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Ka-Yin, any reactions to those comments?
Yes, very, very great comments from Barton, Parmi, and Michel. I think very, very true. We need diversity on board. We need a a wider perspective of decisions being made. And I think what is ultimately important is the mindset of the non-executives, even if it is a majority executive board. So if you have the minority, you are the 3 or 4 outside directors on a majority executive board. If your mindset is such that you want to stay involved, you want the managers to know that you want to stay involved, you get that expectation out correctly right at the beginning, I think you set the interaction in such a way, set it up in such a way that the managers will have to understand and gauge your needs and expectations and factor your views into their management decisions. But if you are one of those outside directors and you sort of like, oh, if I don't get involved, then I'm not responsible. You have that incorrect mindset, then I think you can create all sorts of problems. You can literally let the managers run wild, and not because of the manager's fault, because it's your fault as your outside director. And I think with these days, with the kind of communication tools and technology that we have, and I think your comment is right, Pedro. That it doesn't even take a long document. It's just some thoughtful, periodic communication that is not just a matter of formality. Something thoughtful doesn't have to be long, but something thoughtful, something that informs and allows the reader to feel like they are involved and enable them to stay involved. I think that will actually help build and maintain a very good set of working relations between the executive directors and the non-executive directors, or the management and the board.
Thanks for that. Look, it has been great. Time flies. We are almost there. I would like to ask you in 1 minute, any final messages. We go around in the same order as we started. And, but I would like to say thanks a lot. It has been great. I wish we could do this more time because it's very valuable to our board's community. Parmi, would you like to take your 1 minute final comment?
Sure, and I'll keep it brief. I think we've discussed a lot on this webinar. There's a lot of things happening. I think one constant for all of us is that things are changing rapidly, and I think boards are going to need to remain agile and be adjusting as we go, because I don't think we have all of the answers right now.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. All the best to you, Michel.
I would say the business is doing things, and the boards and management will work even more together, and we will need to ensure we know what our impact is and how we deal with it on ESG matters.
Thanks a lot. All the best to you as well. Barton.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed this. One thing that has struck me is we've made a good number of predictions over the ways in which things will look over the next 3 months, 9 months, or year. And I think one thing that I've noticed in previous crises is we will often forget those good thoughts that we have had immediately after the crisis and plans that we make for the future. So I do think some thoughtful postmortems at different stages along our journey to moving to whatever the new normal is will be helpful to ensure that we're able to constantly calibrate whether or not our predictions and our scenarios make sense, but also to ensure that we're able to capture and remind ourselves of the thoughts and ideas that we have at the moment, so that we might be able to carry forward those that are worth continuing.
Thanks a lot, and all the best to you as well. Thanks a lot, Barton. Ka-Yin, your final comment.
Okay. I think crisis very often can lead to rule change, law change. It can even change cultural aspects. It can make people behave differently, behavioral changes. But of all these changes, and I think the most important thing is for us all to have that mindset to embrace, to be ready for the change, to embrace the change, to be willing to try new tools, new tricks, new mode of doing things, maybe in acquiring new habits, because things are literally changing so fast every day that if we don't embrace that change and we are not ready for that change, we probably may be left out the door when people are already settling into the room of change.
Thanks a lot, Ka-Yin. All the best to you as well. With that, we are coming to an end. It has been a great debate over such a very up-to-date topic. I hope those insights brought from our colleagues again from around the world will be help to board members to overcome this current crisis, but also in the best way of possible, but also to the medium long term. Thanks a lot. I would like to ask the audience not to forget to complete the webinar satisfaction survey that you can access through the QR code being presented. Thanks a lot to everyone. Have a good day or good night. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.